Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another Inside Lowell podcast. I am your host, Teddy Panos, coming to you from the WellPoint Studios here in beautiful downtown Lowell. WellPoint is the only health plan offering benefits exclusively to Massachusetts GIC members. At WellPoint, your whole health is their whole point. And we thank our friends at WellPoint for helping to make this podcast and all of our Inside Lowell podcasts possible. Along with the rest of our podcast sponsors, you'll see their logos scrolling across your screen right there. Of course, our friends at the Washington Savings Bank. Make the switch now to Washington Savings Bank. TMI Properties, quality and value at every price point. Find your perfect space at TMI. Boston North Company, business solutions for restaurant and retail. Mahoney Oil, providing warmth and comfort to Greater Lowell for nearly a century. Francis C. Preventure Insurance, the agency Greater Lowell has counted on for nearly a half century. And by the Massachusetts Pirates, bringing all the hard-hitting action and excitement of arena football to the Mill City. Thank you to all of them, and thank you to all of you for joining us, and thank you to my special guest for this podcast. You probably recognize him. He became a familiar face in the city of Lowell, no doubt, and to our Inside Lowell audience this past summer and fall as he ran a campaign to be the 18th Middlesex State Representative. That one didn't go as you had hoped, but it certainly didn't hurt your business. And that's what we want to talk about. Andrew Kollar is joining us here in the WellPoint Studios. How are you, man?
Doing great. Thanks for having me, Teddy.
Oh, great to have you here. I was excited when you told me what you had been working on and how it kind of would pertain to a discussion that was all the rage here in Lowell last summer and probably will be again next year based on the new ADU law. But before we talk a little bit about that, have you had a chance to kind of decompress from the campaign and kind of look back on that experience? Was it worth it when all was said and done?
Yes, it was absolutely worth it. Really, the only difference from my average day-to-day to running the campaign was all of a sudden I need to have a heightened social media presence to be talking about it and calling attention to myself. Naturally, I am pretty introverted, so I don't like doing that. But the reality is it was overall a very good experience. Mm-hmm. I was very proud of the campaign that we ran. We called attention to important issues. Again, at the end of the day, it was all about demanding we get some accountability. So I wish Mr. Hung good luck in the role, and we will see how that goes.
Yeah, and you're going to stay politically active, I'm assuming, and engaged out there. And
certainly. Nothing's going to change on that front. Whether I run for office again, we'll just say TBD for now. But yeah, I still have positive working relationships with a number of the city councilors. Good friend Michaela of the show is on the Sustainability Council, so yeah, I'm not going anywhere.
And you're diving right into what was a hot button issue, as we mentioned last summer, ADUs, accessory dwelling units, after the city of Lowell kind of shot down an effort to allow them by right.
We deferred to the state.
As was predicted, the Governor Maura Healey and the Massachusetts legislature came in and said, well, guess what? You are all doing them. Lowell, Drake, Chelmsford, Tingsboro, all 330 some odd Massachusetts cities and towns now have a new law under the quote-unquote Affordable Housing Act that kicks in next year in February of 2025. You, being an architect, decided to kind of do a little deep dive into this. So first, before, for those who don't know you, tell me a little bit about your background and what you've been doing as an architect that led to your interest in this issue especially, but also should let people know that you know what you're talking about when you're talking about ADUs and requirements and so on and so forth.
Absolutely. My background is as an architect. I've been licensed and practicing since 2014. I have licenses in 6 states, and my business is primarily about 70% residential work, and the remaining 30 is a combination of light commercial and the occasional government project. Back in 2020 to 2021, thereabouts, I sat on the International Code Council's Building Code Action Committee. Essentially, this is a group of people appointed from all different strata of the professional world, coming together to talk about controversial subjects and how the building codes should be adjusting to accommodate them. The thing is that code development process, it's consensus driven. So you as a layperson could say, I know better. And you have every right to put in a proposal, defend it in front of a board, and ultimately a very large board votes on it and says we like this or we don't like it. During my stint on that committee, somebody had raised, we really need to talk about accessory dwelling units. This was a subject that is an entire blind spot, or at the time was, in the building codes. Coming out of my tenure on that committee, I presented it in front of the board for adding language to the International Zoning Code, and that has been incorporated into the 2024 edition. It does not exist in the International Building Code or the International Residential Code. And the reason for that is we had proposals drafted. You try to get building officials, fire marshals, engineers, architects, everybody on the same page with how you do it properly and responsibly, that is a tall order. We were not going to have the support for it. It was easier to leave this to local or guidance to handle it. In terms of my personal work with ADUs, every year we get more and more people asking. We have one currently being built in Dracut and another one in schematic design in Dracut. That one is now entirely on hold because this new law is making things muddy right now. We have one that's going in front of a zoning board in Nashua, New Hampshire, and we just had one that just came out of the zoning board over in Westford. Probably bring that one up in a little bit because it had some important lessons that we can learn from it. I have one person recently that asked for a proposal for one in Lowell. I told them, let's put a pin in that because right now that's not actually a thing in Lowell. Come February 2nd of next year, maybe it will. And that's what we're going to talk about.
So you've basically looked at this issue of ADUs from a macro perspective.
Yes.
I feel like Kamala Harris here. I'm talking with my hands, but from a macro perspective, you know, like what kind of zoning laws? How do you make them right? To the practical point where you're actually the architect designing them for clients who you want to get it done. And
exactly. At the end of the day, I have no personal grudge one way or another against the concept of an ADU. It creates work for architects and inherently that's good for us. That doesn't mean we look at them and say, these are the God's gift to man. We need to be doing all of these. The inspiration for what the study that I went into for this was over the summer, there was an article in the Boston Globe that talked about the MBTA Communities Act. And I actually found the article rather amusing because it was talking about how a number of cities and towns decided, are there loopholes? Is there a way to work around this? And the reality was, yeah, they were able to say, you know, we can apply these concepts of upzoning to parcels that are already fully developed. We're 100% in compliance. We've done nothing wrong, but you can't do anything about it. And it's not going to make any meaningful change. Undermines what the state was going for. And again, the state's intentions are inherently good. It's does the execution actually match what reality is going to accommodate?
that was going to be my question. How much distance is there between what the state and municipalities are conceptually trying to do and what you as an architect and subsequently the builders who are working on projects with you have to deal with on the ground?
It's a mixed bag. There's been a tremendous amount of misinformation on this subject, from initial concerns about, is this the death of one family zoning? It doesn't have to be, but the way that the language was implemented in the Affordable Housing Act, it kind of does. Now, what does that mean for building code compliance? Again, the building code does not know what an accessory dwelling unit is. There is no definition. If you go to chapter 2 of the residential code, or for that matter, the building code, all it's going to say is a dwelling unit has to provide places for living, eating, sleeping, sanitation, things of that nature. This concept of an ADU only is defined in the International Zoning Code. And in there, we basically say it's a subordinate dwelling unit. It's secondary to a larger unit, and it provides all of those same amenities. But here's the kind of the linchpin of everything. Is it owner occupied or is it a rental property? When you start deviating from one to the other, the building code takes a much more profound impact. And I think we're going to get to that in a little bit.
All right. So this is where people like me kind of lose our minds because the government of Massachusetts just passed this whole all-encompassing ADU ordinance. And yet they have not defined ADUs from the Commonwealth standpoint. They've left it up to individual cities and towns, but they have placed certain limits on what kind of restrictions they can put. Is that a good idea? If you're going to pass this all-encompassing law, shouldn't you at the very least define what an ADU is for these cities and towns? I mean, you know, parking requirements and some of the things that we're going to discuss as we go along. Okay, I get it. Leave it up to because each city and town is different. But the legal definition of what an accessory dwelling unit is should be uniform, should it not?
It is, and that's where, again, the legal definition as it's worded in the new law, Section 7, Section 1A of Chapter 40A of Massachusetts General Laws. An accessory dwelling unit is a self-contained housing unit inclusive of sleeping, cooking, and sanitary facilities on the same lot as a principal dwelling, subject to otherwise applicable dimensional and parking requirements, yada, yada, yada. Then it starts to get into some of those little nuanced details where they set, 900 square foot size limit, parking, yes or no. If you're close enough to public transportation, a bus stop, a train station, you don't need any parking space. If you're outside of that, all right, the town can allow you to have or require at least one space. Should they be defining it? Absolutely. Now, the catch is, does every town need to be exactly the same? From a building code perspective, it makes designers' life 1,000 times easier. That's why since 1972, every municipality in the state is on the same state building code. Trying to do work in states that don't have a common building code is an absolute nightmare. Zoning, however, is regulated town by town, city by city, because the reality is how somebody chooses to develop property here in Lowell is probably not the same expectations that the people on the Cape want. Probably not the same as the people out in Western Mass. It's all relative, or at least in my opinion, it should be.
Okay. So and you kind of touched on this, but the perception is that basically anything goes now. And as you alluded to a few minutes ago, this is the end. This is the death of single family zoning.
To an extent, yes, but it's not quite as bad as people think. At the end of the day, you don't want to have it's not being fully unregulated. You still have to go to the city or the township, file a permit with the building department, and get approval to create this accessory dwelling unit. It has to be under 900 square feet. You have to provide the secondary entrance. Catch is we don't have to be owner occupied anymore. So if you're following the guidelines, yes, you're still filing permits. City inspectors are coming out. They're checking on it, making sure it meets life safety requirements. That is okay. In terms of, can every house do this? Well, there's a little bit of nuance to that. If you have to build an addition, for example, to do it, you might not be able to do it without still going for variances. Most towns still have a requirement for something like floor area ratio.
Well, just to back you up by saying,
Sure.
If you have to build an addition, you're talking about a quote unquote detached accessory dwelling unit.
It could be an addition on your house, or it could be a detached one.
Okay.
As opposed to, let's say it's fully incorporated into the house. If I say I want to convert my basement into an ADU, you know what? There's probably not a lot of recourse that a town can push back against that because it's probably already been accounted for in my zoning. Lowell, for example, counts basements as part of floor area ratio. Many towns do not. So if I had a property, I don't think Chelmsford had it counted basements, and you put it down there, if you suddenly exceed the allowable requirements, zoning board might have the authority to take a look at it. It could provoke a lawsuit if the board wanted to vote it down. But if I have to build an addition on my house to suddenly have enough square footage to create the ADU, you're still subject to setbacks, height requirements, things of that nature. So there might be other things involved that could rein you in a little bit.
Okay. Are the setbacks, height requirements uniform under this new law?
Not one bit, because every single city and town defines them for themselves. In my study, I looked at there's 7 or 8 different towns around basically the greater Lowell area. Lowell, Chelmsford, Billerica, Tingsboro, Westford, just to try to get a sense for comparison of what does single-family zones require, what does two-family zones require, and how do we start thinking about ADUs in that conversation. So yeah, if every town has different setback requirements, there are still local constraints that might affect a decision to create an ADU. It's not a free-for-all. You can't just suddenly say, I'm the king of my castle, I'm going to go out and build this. You still have to follow the rules.
Okay. You touched on the fact that the state law says doesn't have to be owner-occupied, which is a restriction a lot of communities place, which tells me you also don't need to have a family unit member living in that.
Not one bit.
So in essence, you've created a whole bunch of new landlords for folks who do this.
And I've already heard developers talking about exploiting that.
Okay.
Yes.
Great. Look, find any rule, find any law, and immediately someone will get an attorney to find a way to,
of course.
to get around
How do I
it.
make money off this?
But but if you're the one who say, yeah, you know what, I've got the right house, I've got the right size lot for this, I'm going to get into this business. Are you beholden to the same requirements that any landlord is, right down from responsibilities, maintaining the property, certain things you have to do, right down to the way you market it, because you have to go out and say, hey, I've got an ADU, you can come here and live here, I don't have to know you, etc. Do you have to go by all those laws? There's a bunch of laws, discrimination laws, ways you list something, etc. Does all this apply with ADUs, or does the law not,
I'll be honest,
address that?
It's, to my knowledge, the law does not address that. That's fairly vague in terms of how that's going to be applied in practice. From my understanding of the 361 municipalities in the state of Massachusetts, it's either 11 or 18 of them currently allow rental ADUs. And to my knowledge, all of them are on the Cape. I have not done any work down on the Cape involving an ADU, so I can't even point to you exactly which towns those are. That was behind a paywall on some real estate agent's website. So I'm not sure what those were exactly. The reality is most towns are going to have to modify their zoning bylaws by February of next year to suddenly allow this rental component, if they even allowed ADUs in the first place. I have a real concern when you eliminate the familial connection. We kept hearing over and over that this is all about, we want to create affordable housing. It's about more units. And I buy that argument when you tell me that, oh, your kid's going to is staying home when they're going to college, they're going to UMass Lowell. Okay, this keeps them in the house, but it gives them their own separate dwelling unit in the house. There's a sense of connection there. You say, oh, I've got my grandmother or my in-laws, they want to come stay with us. They're getting on in years. This is better. It keeps them close to family and in the community they love. That's great. Those are affordable housing components. When you have basically the historical analog for all of this concept of ADUs, was servants' quarters. It's, oh, I have a caretaker that lives on site, a live-in nanny, whatever it might be. This is why, again, you've got carriage houses and all these things like that. It's not a bad thing because they were effectively an extension of the family. There's a level of trust, there's a connection, and it also, that familial connection kind of gave a little bit of a free pass to building officials to look the other way with how you regulate ADUs from a building code perspective. Since the building code ignores them, they would simply say, okay, well, if there's a direct continuity, it's free flowing from one side to the other, you know what? This is reasonable. You people get to know each other. One side is checking on the other. You're maintaining property values and things. It made sense. Suddenly you switch to this rental approach, which is what has been done in California. Well, if you don't know who's on the other side, is it being properly maintained? Is it a fire hazard? Your guess is as good as mine. And this is why I think that's kind of an error in the way that this was put together. And when building officials now have to look at what are we going to do come February 2nd, the simple answer is do exactly what the building code tells you to do. If you have 2 dwelling units in a house, you treat it like a 2-family. 2 families, I need fire separations between unit 1 and unit 2. Doesn't matter if it's accessory at that point, because at the end of the day, if there isn't a fire rating between them, who knows what's going to happen.
And also a little warning to the folks who want to use it as a landlord and a rental. Good luck getting rid of that problem tenant.
Oh yeah,
that you talked about, who may not be maintaining it, may suddenly stop paying their rent, etc. You're probably going to be beholden once the courts get into it, because I can't imagine it'll be too long after February 2nd.
Oh no, it will absolutely happen.
This will kick in.
That hearing that I did in Westford recently, where again the ADU law had already passed, it hasn't gone into effect, and the board basically disclosed to the public at the hearing, we cannot deny them the concept of a detached ADU in this case. We can talk about maybe conditions that we could set. Theoretically, if we waited out the clock to February 2nd, they probably couldn't even do that. And one woman stood up in front of the room and asked, what is this going to do for my property values? I bought here 20 plus years ago because I liked this bucolic 1-family cul-de-sac. That's wonderful. Come February 2nd, you and every one of your neighbors can put one of these up. Is it good for your property values? Consult a real estate agent. One is going to tell you it'll be fine. Others are going to tell you that this is not going to be great. There is no one-size-fits-all answer to that question. It probably is contextual to your neighborhood.
We'll know once we do it. Can you have more than one ADU on a lot?
Typically, no. And I say typically because there are some very weird exceptions that pop up around the country. And the one that we kept talking about when I was on that committee with the International Code Council were townhouses. Now, townhouses are a unique situation where they are regulated under the one family residential code, just like two families are. They're all just attached together, and people were basically carving out their basements and making them into ADUs. Well, most of the time, people are doing this in one-family dwellings. I don't think I've even come across somebody in a two-family dwelling asking to do it, or at least not seriously enough that a project ever went forward. They tried asking the town if you could do it.
Could you now?
No.
No.
The way the law is worded is that you have to be in a single-family dwelling in a single-family zoning district. And you are only allowed one ADU. If you wanted to request more than it, theoretically, you can. But at that point, jurisdiction pivots back over to the local township, and their zoning board is going to be the one making that call if they're willing to grant it. I have not encountered anybody asking for more than one on a property.
Okay. We're chatting with Andrew Kollar, architect, former Lowell State Representative candidate as well. He's doing a deep dive into ADUs, accessory dwelling units, and how the new law, which goes into effect February 2nd, Groundhog Day?
Groundhog's Day.
Groundhog Day, love it. How
We're going to be living through this again, so.
Yeah, how it's going to affect you as an architect, but also how it's going to affect our communities. Let's talk about the three communities that we cover here at Inside Lowell.
Sure.
Lowell, Chelmsford, and Dracut. Which community is in for the biggest culture shock?
Of them, I'm going to say Chelmsford is in for the biggest culture shock.
Okay, why?
Chelmsford zoning is probably the biggest disparity between one and two family dwellings compared to any of those other ones. So I think they're probably going to feel this more than anybody else. So let's take Dracut, for example, because Dracut is one of the ones that is the easiest that they could actually address this directly head on if they really wanted to. I know I'm jumping the gun a little on this. Dracut, they're one and two family zones. Oh, you need 40,000 square feet here or 80,000 here. And when you go up to the two family zone, that drops down to 60,000 square feet. Their front yard requirements are the same in all of them. Side yards are the same in all of them. Rear yards, maximum building height, the maximum number of stories. Theoretically, the zoning really is almost homogeneous. It's fairly simple and straightforward, which makes sense. Dracut is a little more rural than some of the other local communities. Houses tend to be more spread apart. You're not necessarily going to notice this. Now, if they wanted to proactively take this on, they actually have a mechanism in place through upzoning that will let them do that. And I know we're going to talk about that soon. Lowell, we're kind of middle of the ground. We have a whole bunch of different zones. Suburban character neighborhoods, traditional characters neighborhoods, urban use, and then
Lowell is kind of a state in and of itself, right? Between your big sprawling houses and lots versus your crammed in neighborhoods in the acre.
In terms of having a response, Lowell can take a more of a piecemeal, balanced approach. They can find a way. Lowell will have a little bit of a culture shock because of the three of them, we're the only ones that don't allow ADUs today. We punted this back to the state, and I understand why they did that. And the funny thing is, if you wanted to build an ADU in Lowell today, if it's owner occupied, there is a mechanism to do it. Our building department is actually very responsible on this front. There's nothing in the building residential code that prohibits more than one kitchen. When I worked on Long Island for 9 years, if you saw a second kitchen, it was automatically a rental unit. The towns would lose their mind. Lowell will look at it and say, as long as you're not putting door locks on the bedrooms on the outside rather than the inside, you're not putting doors blocking one side from the other, this is just an expansion of your home. Treat it like the summer kitchens that some cultures like to have. Mm-hmm. You can build that today. We've done it on a few projects, and that's okay. But once it switches over to a rental property, well, now it's a two-family. Come February 2nd, now we're just going to have to fall in line or find a way to work with it.
Okay, you answered my question. I was going to say, the moment you put an ADU on your single-family home, you're no longer single-family. You become a two-family.
I would argue no. At that point, as soon as you put an ADU, you should be defining yourself as a two-family.
But if you live in a single-family zone,
And this,
In other words, you could single-handedly change the zoning of your
and I got into this with
zone, right?
Again, I got into this with a colleague a little over a week ago. We were on a call with the Government Affairs Committee for the American Institute of Architects, and they're like, no, if this is a one-family zone and you have an ADU, that property in perpetuity needs to be sold as a one-family dwelling. Again, I can go to the pet store and buy a dog, and I can name it Goldfish. I didn't buy a goldfish, I still bought a dog. Well, what are we getting into now? I think it's going to get a little murky and messy for a little while.
Yeah, that's most certainly going to get, especially in a community like Lowell. Are there uniform requirements now between Chelmsford, Dracut, and Lowell that are going to have to change?
In a broad sense, you're going to all be required to have the separate means or entry and exit from the building for the second dwelling unit. They're all going to be constrained by a size limitation. Parking to some degree, yes, you do have a requirement there. But the thing with building codes in general is, while they're trying to be prescriptive to maintain life safety and fire safety, the goal isn't to basically tell you this is the only way you can do it. There's still some level of freedom to how many bedrooms is it going to be? What does it look like? So it's not creating a homogenized character.
But so it's not forcing Lowell to change some of its lot sizes. Lowell will not have to do that.
They do not
to conform with this,
and
they won't have to be similar to Chelmsford's or Chelmsford similar to Dracut, etc. Each individual
all the zoning ordinances
municipality
can basically stay the same. And from my understanding, the state is supposed to be providing guidance to each individual town for what this could start to look like, how they could modify their zoning ordinances to accommodate. The only document I've seen so far, I saw a law firm had provided information to one of the local towns that basically just talked about what the law is and to start basically buckling their seatbelts. And even at that, there were still open-ended questions.
Mm-hmm. How does Milton is that the town that's fighting back on the MBTA communities? Yeah. How that case gets resolved play into this discussion, and what will the inevitable legal battles that'll come when somebody is denied or
I would say you use the exact right word there. It's inevitable. The Milton case study is going to show us how much authority the state has to interject themselves into local zoning decisions. And the reality is, if Milton wins on this, that's not going to reflect well for the state, and it is probably going to cascade to other communities taking a similar response.
Could that be the end of the ADU law? If Milton wins on the MBTA communities, because a lot of the issues are similar here, right?
I would say it is plausible. I don't want to go so far as to say that, yes, it's not going to be, oh, we have an affirmative for them on this, and that automatically is going to put this down. But I think it will be just a matter of time until there is a lawsuit where somebody is citing that as precedent, if they are able to use it effectively. And I think no matter what happens with this, you are going to see some lawsuits come out of it where people feel they were unjustly denied an application. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So let's get to the money discussion for all the city and town managers and elected officials and planning board members, et cetera. What can cities and towns do that want to go the Milton route but don't want to end up in a costly legal battle with the state that could, backfire on them? You've done a deep dive into this, and by the way, you have put together we can't go public with this yet, right? Or
not quite,
not for public release yet. But.
Not just yet, because again, I wanted to put this together as an editorial or at least a white paper, something, and I just have not had the time, the luxury to put this together in that format. So right now, it's a large collection of notes,
and there's a lot of in-depth stuff. And the thing that jumped out at me is said, you can do something as simple as rezone your single-family districts to two-family districts. Now, for the folks who raise their arms in horror at the death of the single-family district, this is the death of the single-family district. But you're saying this little maneuver, might allow the loophole. I'm sorry, the legal way to deal with some of these requirements.
I'm the first to acknowledge.
How so?
I am not an attorney. I do not have a license to practice law. My license is to practice architecture.
But you're hypothesizing
my read on this, and again, I'm just going to read the very beginning of the new law, Section 8, or Section 8, Section 3 of Chapter 40A. No zoning ordinance or bylaw shall prohibit, unreasonably restrict, or require a special permit or other discretionary zoning approval for the use of land for structures for a single family or single accessory dwelling unit or the rental thereof in a single family residential zoning district. So, the important thing here is that we have a single family dwelling zone and a single family building. So I, for example, live in a one-family dwelling that's built in a two-family zone. I, as of right, can convert it to a two-family at some point, and there's not really much anybody can do to stop me. It doesn't necessarily work in reverse. So, work through the logic. If I have a law that only applies to one-family dwelling zones, don't have a one-family dwelling zone. If you are willing to take your current single-family zones and do what's considered upzoning, moving to a higher density, something like that, or at least the impression of doing so, all of a sudden, in a two-family zone, ADUs aren't required by state law. This law disappears. Now, this is where people's hair will start sticking on end and the fires are going off. What do you mean about I'm going to lose my single-family home? Not necessarily. Lowell is actually a very good case study for this one. So, if I flip over to, and I like using the traditional neighborhood single family and two family because the numbers aren't that far apart from each other in our zoning bylaws. The required lot size in a single family TSF zone is 7,000 square feet. In the traditional two family, that goes down to 6,000 square feet if I have a one family dwelling. That goes down to 4,000 square feet if it's a two family in that traditional two family district. So if I wanted to have an actual two family dwelling, I need 4,000 square feet per dwelling unit. That's 8,000. Now, if my single family currently lives on a 7,000 square foot lot, my lot isn't magically going to find another 1,000 square feet to add that extra dwelling unit. All of a sudden, all control over that decision is no longer granted as of right like it would be through the ADU law. Now it goes through the zoning board, which is where it would have been if we maintained the owner occupancy conditional special use permit example. And again, this is not one-to-one for every town. Not every town has this minimum lot area per dwelling unit criteria. I particularly like it. And you could just as easily say, hey, I don't want to completely throw the baby out with the bathwater. Chelmsford, as I mentioned, would be a nightmare to try to move from one family to two family, shifting from one to the other. The numbers are just so disparate, you drive yourself crazy. Now, if you go back and you amend your table of permitted approved uses, and you say you can build two families in a one family zone, but for those individual zones, you've now added in a component like minimum lot area per dwelling unit, set a number that is realistic. If you make it overly restrictive, it's going to get challenged in court. If you pick a number that is modest, feels like you're actually giving a reasonable consideration, you know what? I think you're not going to get as much pushback on it. I think the legal system would uphold it as you're not in violation of the will of the law. But all of a sudden, a lot of one-family zone or houses are going to get to keep exactly what they have right now with no great loss. Now, this always is a two-sided coin. Lowell is a good example here. In my area of the Highlands, a lot of one-family zone homes not going to change at all as a result of this. If anything, they would just have to suddenly go and maybe get a permit or something to do the second unit in the basement or something, if they can even have the space to do it. Places like Belvedere, where you've got much larger lots, you know, they're probably going to lose this battle no matter what approach it is. So again,
which is where the political fun starts in Lowell. When
exactly,
as soon as you mention that B word,
and again, there's no denying it. The reality is, every resident of Belvedere, whether you like it or not, come February 2nd, you and all of your neighbors can now apply for an accessory dwelling unit up to 900 square feet. And I've done enough work in Belvedere. Most of those properties can more than accommodate it. If you switched it to a two-family zone, all right, you know, maybe it could be good for you. Maybe it might just be shifting the same argument.
So ironically, you're saying that by going to two family, you might be able to avoid or eliminate some of the properties.
That's
that
it. In many cases,
in like a neighborhood like Belvedere.
that's just it. Some properties in Belvedere or places like Belvedere where those two families could then grow in size, you might end up having a little bit more of a headache with this. Whereas places like the Highlands, the Acre, Back Central, places that are more densely populated, I think you'd see a lot more single family houses remain just the way they are. And if anything, when people want to go do additions or other projects on their house, the zoning might actually roll back a little bit for them and eliminate certain variances or things that were non-conforming in the first place. Because again, our city's developed over a few hundred years. Many of the houses predate when we had any zoning code here at all. So yeah, in some cases, you actually might make life easier for some people while still protecting their one-family dwellings, even in the face of there's a possibility you could end up with a two-family.
So I am sure every municipality's legal department is already kind of looking at these with their planning and zoning boards.
Everyone is, and the reality is that a lot of them are nervous or concerned or just plain out confused. I'm doing work in so many different towns with these lately. They all have different opinions, and one of them outright told me, we want to advocate for getting a moratorium in place come November, basically like a stay of execution. They're not sure what's coming, and in some cases they said, could you put your projects on hold for a few months until we figure it out? Well, if that's what you're asking, then fine, we'll try to accommodate, but it really is getting into the Wild West now.
There are folks who say that one of the reasons the governor and the state legislature passed this was because they looked at what happened in Lowell, and it was very similar to what's happened in a lot of other communities. And they said, if we don't force you to, you're never going to do this on your own. And, and would Lowell have been better off passing their ordinance last summer, or were they going to get some of the stuff shoved on them anyway? In other words, had the ordinance passed the way it was written, I guess, well, we did have a parking requirement, so that would...
We did, and again,
that would
even the new parking
right?
requirement, if you are more than a half a mile, I think it is, from public transit, you are allowed to still require that they provide a parking space. Even when we wrote the model language, we said, you know what, one parking space is not unreasonable. We are living in the United States. We are very much a car culture, no matter how much people may dislike that. Providing it one space off street is a good idea.
So while Lowell would have had to adjust what they were trying to pass last year, are you saying it is more onerous today than what Lowell was working on? Had Lowell just passed it?
I think there's a fighting argument to that. I'd have to go back and look at exactly how Lowell's language is written, but...
Which was an argument, by the way, that Councilor John Drinkwater, who was the leading proponent on the council of this,
I know
was
John.
making like it's gonna, you now got something worse than you could have had. You could have gotten ahead of this.
And don't get me wrong, I know John. I like working with John. I actually helped on one of his Senate campaigns a couple of years ago. ADUs do not have to be a bad thing. It's this question of, if your reason for it is you want affordable housing, you didn't get that when you passed this law presently written. Everything now is going to be market driven. And that's, again, not necessarily a bad thing either, because the argument is, if you have greater supply, the price of housing in general is going to come down.
Provided you don't increase the demand.
Right.
Which we are not exactly doing here in Lowell and elsewhere.
No. And again, this is where, yes, there's always more that can be done to create density and additional units. But again, it's not hard to find people with that not in my backyard mentality of, I bought it here 20 years ago, shouldn't I get to keep it forever? I can understand why you want that. Again, I like being in a one-family dwelling myself. I don't long for going back to the age of being in a dormitory or an apartment building.
Yeah, not with a newborn roaming around. All right, so we're recording this. It's October 18th.
Yes.
We're recording this. New law kicks in February 2nd. You've discussed some things that municipalities might be able to do proactively.
Yes.
Is there enough time? It's 3.5 months.
Yeah.
Is there enough? You know how the zoning
reality
and
is,
planning board requirements change, the process you have to go through to get it done. Anyone watching this now on October 18th or shortly thereafter says, we've got to do this stat. Is there enough time to do it?
The reality is there probably is not enough time to pursue upzoning if you're just starting the process today. If some of these conversations have been happening behind the scenes, then I'm just not privy to them because I don't work for those townships. You know what? That's great. You might actually be able to make it beforehand. The reality is, if you start the conversation now, you could potentially start getting the pieces in place, and even after the new law goes into effect, and you will have to fall into compliance on that first day. If after that, whether it's a month, 6 months, a year later, you create a new law that basically says, well, the old law doesn't apply anymore, I don't see anything wrong with that. I personally like the idea of saying these decisions for zoning should be handled at the local jurisdiction. I don't like one-size-fits-all solutions. It's not my style. I think the state law is overreaching. I think the way it should have been written was, we want to allow these by right in one-family zoning districts. We leave it up to the local jurisdictions to define what that means to you. I think that was the right way to do it. You even could have put in a reference pointing you to the International Zoning Code for guidance on how to do that. But unfortunately, that's not what we got. And I'm very concerned about how many building officials, commissioners actually weighed in on this law with their local state reps and senators before it was passed.
So basically what you're saying is your last chance, your Hail Mary pass attempt, if you want no ADUs,
if you don't want
you better
ADUs,
pray Milton wins that lawsuit and that it then translates over to this new housing law.
Pretty much. Yeah, it's a good way of putting it. Is keep a close eye on that court case because it is going to have profound implications. And if you really don't want ADUs, but you're willing to at least explore how upzoning could potentially put you into a way of bringing compliance without doing that while preserving your one-family dwellings, I think it can be done. But yeah, you got to be willing to put in the work for it. And you have to recognize that there's going to be a transitional period in there where you're going to be doing what the state wants before you get to do what you want again.
Yeah. So conversely, if you want to put an ADU on your property, you better act quickly. You better be ready to go on February 2nd with your proposal, your application, and get in there quickly, just in case the Milton case comes back and throws a monkey wrench into it.
Especially in a place like the city of Lowell. Absolutely. If you are in one of the neighboring communities that has allowable requirements right now for accessory dwelling units, you're probably not in quite as much of a rush. Now, again, if you want to maintain that you can have it as a rental property, that's not a bad idea to try to have ready to go shortly after the new law comes into effect. But yeah, it definitely is going to be a little bit of a muddy future.
All right. So a little bit of advice and information for folks on either side of the ADU issue, whether you want one or whether you want to stop them at all costs.
Exactly. At the end of the day, I'm the first to say, I don't have a dog in this fight. If somebody wants me to design an ADU for them, I will send you a proposal, and I will.
How do they get a hold of Andrew Kollar, the architect?
And I will draw it. That's fine. I will design it to whatever the local zoning ordinances require and what the building codes say we have to do. But again, the other side of it is, what is it going to be for cost? If I have to build all of these new ADUs as two-family dwellings, all of a sudden I need fire separation. So that's a lot more fire-rated sheetrock than we had previously, which would have been almost none in a family-owned one. Again, some towns might say there is a distinction between how they regulate owner-occupied versus not. It's going to be really weird the first couple months. But yes, if somebody wants to reach out to me to talk about this type of project or really almost anything, you can go to my website, viewstudios.org. Or feel free to just Google me. It's not hard to find me online.
Yeah, not anymore, right?
No.
All right. Andrew Kollar, thanks so much for joining us and shedding a little bit more light on this this law that kicks in 3.5 months from today. We'll talk soon, I'm sure.
Sounds good.
All
Thanks,
right.
Eddie.
Thank you to Andrew, and thank you to you for joining us here as well. February 2nd, 2025, the new state affordable housing, aka ADU law, goes into effect. How will it affect you? How will it affect your community? Hopefully we gave you a little better understanding of it, especially for those of you here in the city of Lowell and the towns of Dracut and Chelmsford. Until next time, stay safe, everybody.